Good to go.
Okay, have you started recording?
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep, it's good.
Okay. All right, we are ready to roll. Day 4. This is the last of our Introduction to Ecology class, and it will be the most exciting, I promise. All right. So just a little reminder, where have we been, where are we going today? A reminder of what ecology is, a study of the distribution and abundance of species in nature. In our 4 class lectures, we initially talked about the physical environment as the arena in which all of this happens. We then talked about the ecology of individuals, mostly physiological ecology and behavioral ecology. Last week, the 3rd lecture was a somewhat more quantitative analysis of the ecology of populations. And today, the last lecture will be the ecology of communities and ecosystems, the kind of everything thrown together. Communities and ecosystems. Well, here's one, just to get us started, a lovely picture of a coral reef somewhere showing lots of different species. And to begin this, I want to introduce you to the concept of what ecologists call the interaction web. An interaction web is an abstraction, as many things in science and in ecology are, and it's abstraction of the way in which the physical environment and all of the species are linked together in a network of interactions. So food is important to species, and temperature is important to species, and competition and predation are important to species, and all of these things are linked together in this entity which we refer to as the interaction web. And I've shown you here a representation, a gross representation of an interaction web that was put together for a report that the National Research Council did on multiple stressors to marine mammals. And I just happened to be on that working group or on that committee. And this was an illustration that we put together to encapsulate the concept. All right. So these arrows represent the linkages among species and so on and so forth. It's nothing you can do anything with. It helps you think about the way nature is put together at levels beyond populations. So a roadmap for today's last class, I'm going to talk about 4 things, some fairly briefly, others in much more detail. Since ecology is about the distribution and abundance of species, an obvious question is how many species are there? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about species area relationships, how the abundance of species changes as the area of measurement changes or becomes larger. Then we're going to move into species interactions and talk about bottom-up versus top-down forcing in consumer-prey interactions. And I'll get back to an explanation of what that really means when we get to that point. And then the last part will be on what I call ecological networks, the linkage and connectivity of nature within communities and between communities. So that's where we're going today. How many species? Well, the current estimate, or at least a couple of years ago when I last looked into this, was about 1.8 million extant described species on Earth. Maybe a little more than that now, but that's fairly close. How many are there? This is the number that have been described. How many are there? Nobody knows. The best estimates are somewhere between probably 10 and 15 million on the low end, up to as many as 100 million extant species on the high end. How could that be? How could it be that so large a proportion of the total species on a world that is so overrun with people looking could be unknown? And the reason for this is that there is a very strong relationship between species diversity and body size. Most of the species on Earth, whether they be microbes, whether they be plants, or whether they be animals, are little. And so one analysis of this, just to put it into perspective, which was done by by Robert May about 30 years ago, was that there is about a tenfold reduction for every tenfold reduction in the length of a species, there is about a 100-fold increase in the number of species. So the larger ones are really well known. We know most of those. Every once in a while, somebody will find a new bird or a mammal or a fish or something somewhere. Most of those are known. The small ones are poorly known. All right. If we extrapolate this general view of the diversity of species back across the history of life on Earth, we estimate, or paleontologists and historical biologists estimate, that about 99.9% of the species that have existed over the history of life on Earth are now extinct. And for that reason, there have been an estimated 1.5 to as many as 10 billion species over the history of life on Earth. That just gives you a sense of how many there are now and how many there have been. All right. Now I want to move to species area relationships. All right. So what is a species area relationship? Well, imagine that you're standing out in the redwood forest and you're looking down at your feet, or maybe just around you, and you will see a small number of species. And if you measure them carefully, you will still see a relatively small number of species. And as you expand that area, as it becomes larger and larger and larger to encompass the entire forest, the entire county of Santa Cruz, the entire state of California, and so on and so forth, as that area expands, the number of species will necessarily go up. So the number of species, represented by S, is a function of area. It always is a function of area. And the way that that function works, to the extent that that functional relationship is a monotonically increasing function, that is to say, it doesn't go up and down and up and down and up and down as area keeps going up, which there's no reason to believe it ever would do that. If it's a monotonically increasing relationship, then we can define that functional relationship as the number of species equals some constant, doesn't matter what it is, just some constant, which might vary depending upon whether you're in a desert or whether you're in a coral reef or wherever, times area to some exponent. And what people that have worked on species area relationships have done to simplify this is they have simply log transformed this. So if we log transform this simple exponential function, that translates into the log of the species number equals the log of this constant, whatever it is, times the exponent, or I'm sorry, plus the exponent times the log of area. So this gives us a straight line. That's why it's so useful to make the log transformation. So here is a species area relationship for British plants. And it starts out in a very small area. This particular example actually came out of the ecology text that I used to teach from. And for a very small area, the log area you can see here is quite small for this bit Surrey, wherever that is. Some of you might know. And as you can see, as the area becomes larger and larger and larger, all the way up to the whole of the British Isles, the number of species, the log area of species goes up. And sure enough, it's a fairly good linear function, linear relationship. You would see something very similar to this no matter where you went if you were to do the same sort of analysis. And this sort of thing has been done, all right? So no real surprises there. I think the real interesting question is, what is this relationship? What is the slope of this line? What is the value of Z? So now I'm going to move to island patterns, because island patterns are different, all right? And here is an example showing why island, or how island patterns are different. Not why, but how they're different. So this is another analysis of plant species in France, all right? But in this particular case, not only does it include the mainland France, the green line, but it includes a bunch of islands that are part of the French, the country and surrounding islands of the country. And these range in size from very small to somewhat larger. And as you can see, these red dots are the species area relationship for the islands. Same part of the world, same pool of species, all the rest of it. The slope is higher. The slope is higher. So there's a difference. Islands are different from continents. Islands are different in terms of the species area relationship. Why is that? Why is Z greater for islands than it is for the unbroken continental habitat? And it's really simple. Smaller islands, the little ones, have proportionally fewer species. That's what makes the slope higher for islands. They have proportionally fewer species, the very smaller ones. And that's because on little islands, because they're so small, the probability of extinction is elevated. And also because they're islands and little islands, the probability of them getting hit by a colonist is also reduced. And so the little islands have proportionally fewer species, and that's why the slope is as it is. Ecologists, biogeographers have been interested in islands for a long time, and one of the most influential ideas in all of ecology is a theory called the theory of island biogeography. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that theory because every ecology course that's ever been taught to anybody in the last 40 years has explained and talked about this intriguing theory. And this is a theory that was developed by Robert MacArthur at Princeton and Ed Wilson at Harvard. And they published this as a Princeton monograph called The Equilibrium Theory of Island Biogeography. It was published back in 1972, somewhere around in there, I think. Okay. The basic premise, theory of island biogeography, is that the number of species on any island represents a balance, that is an equilibrium between immigrants, the numbers coming in, and they're coming in all the time from the mainland, and extinction, the numbers that are being lost. And they are being lost all the time as these populations, eventually these small populations, dwindle to extinction. So the theory of island biogeography, which is very similar in a way to the equilibrium theories of competition that we talked about last time, is built around these parameters, all right? So I'm going to go through the theory and explain it to you just a little bit because it's cool. It's an interesting theory. Pretty intuitive, actually. So let's let big P equal the number of species in the mainland source pool. This is the total number of species that there can be in this particular system. Let's just say in France, it's the total number of species in the country of France. S is the number of species on any particular island. Lambda, remember we use lambda as sort of a birth rate when we were talking about population biology. In this treatment, lambda sub S is the immigration rate. It's the number of new species coming in from the mainland source pool to the island. And the other side of that is the extinction rate, and we're going to use mu sub S as that. And that is simply the number of species that are already present that are going extinct, all right? So these are rates. This is the number per year, or the number per day, or the number per hour, and similarly for the extinction rate. So the change in the number of species through time, which is a simple differential equation, is simply going to be the number coming minus the number lost, the number of immigrants versus the number of extinctions. It's as simple as that. Just like populations are the change in numbers of individuals in a population is the birth rate minus the death rate. Changes in the number of species is the immigration rate minus the extinction rate. So what we want to know is what's the equilibrium number? How many species will eventually come to be on an island? That is, we want to know when this differential equation, dSTD dt, the rate of change per time in species number equals 0. And this is going to occur just like in populations when birth rate equals death rate. This is going to occur when the immigration rate equals the extinction rate, all right? So how do we figure this out? This is what MacArthur and Wilson did. They did it graphically and mathematically, and the graphical solution is pretty elegant and pretty cool, pretty interesting. So I'm just going to explain it to you, all right? So what they did, first of all, was develop a functional relationship. Again, we're going back to functional relationships because they're so common in science. Functional relationship between species, what do I have here? No, it doesn't matter. Functional relationship between the number of species that are there and the immigration rate. So when the number of species is zero, let's imagine an island that was just formed and there are no species at all on that island. When the number of species is zero, the immigration rate is going to be the highest that it can possibly be, right? Because every possible species is a new immigrant. And that maximum immigration rate we're going to call I, all right? Similarly, when the number of species on the island is P, in other words, when every species that's in the country of France or whatever the mainland pool is there, the immigration rate by definition is going to be zero. So if we use those 2 points, I where S equals 0 and 0 where S equals P, and we assume that this functional relationship is linear, all we have to do is draw a line between the two and we have our relationship. We can compute from that conceptually what the rate of immigration is going to be at any abundance of species between 0 and P, all right? And the slope of that line is going to be the rise over the run, as it always is. In this case, it's the fall over the run. It's a declining function, all right? So that is going to be I over P, all right? And the origin of the equation, where S equals 0, is going to be I. So in this case, the formulation for the immigration rate is simply going to be lambda sub S equals I minus IP over S. That's the functional relationship. You can do exactly the same thing for extinction rates. The logic is entirely the same, all right? Except in this case, we're going to use E as the maximum extinction rate, which is always going to occur when there are the maximum number of species in the system, all right? So where the number of species equals P, the extinction rate is going to be maximum because there are going to be more species there, and it's going to be 0 when there aren't any species there at all. There can't be any extinctions if there aren't any species there. Here again, the rise over the run defines the slope of this line. We can root this function at S equals 0 and S equals P, and the extinction rate for species at any particular abundance of species is going to be EP times S, all right? So now we have a function for the extinction rate and for the immigration rate on an island. So all we have to do is ask, what is the species abundance where the extinction rate equals the immigration rate, all right? We've developed a formulation for the immigration rate. We've developed a formulation for the extinction rate as a function of species. Equilibrium occurs where this equals 0. In other words, equilibrium occurs where this equals this, all right? And so all you have to do is set up this equation and solve it for S. Seems complicated? It's not. It's just simple algebra, very simple graphics and algebra. And that gives us an equilibrium species abundance of I times P divided by I plus E, the quantity, which is totally not intuitive. At least in my mind, it's not intuitive, but algebraically, mathematically, logically, it's very intuitive. So what that means is that we have some species abundance, which is the equilibrium rate, okay? And that is going to be defined by the point at which this immigration function crosses the extinction function. When the abundance of species becomes larger than that, it's going to decline. When the abundance of species becomes lower than that, it's going to increase, all right? And that's how conceptually we characterize the number of species that would occur on an island based on this equilibrium theory of island biogeography of MacArthur and Wilson's. And you can do a few cool things with this. You can assume or infer from this how you might expect the equilibrium species abundance to differ between small and large islands. Just assuming that a small island is going to have a higher extinction rate than a large island, just because the populations of species on small islands are going to be smaller and therefore more likely to go extinct. And so this tells us that gives us a way of conceptualizing what the difference in equilibrium species numbers would be between a small island and a large island, everything else being equal. We can also look at the distance effect. As islands get further and further and further from the mainland source, but otherwise remain the same. And in the distance effect, immigration on the far island is going to be less than immigration on the near island. It's going to be harder for a species to get to an island that's a long ways away than it is for it to get to a species that's an island that's very close. And so there again, we see that the equilibrium species on far islands is very much less than the equilibrium species number on near islands. So this is basically the logic of the theory of island biogeography, and what a lot of biogeographers did was to try to parameterize these models and look at data in nature. So here is another figure from the old text that I used to use on the number of bird species on islands in, I believe, all across Indonesia. And this is broken up by island area from the teeniest little islands. This is again a log plot, and the number of bird species on the island. And the red dots represent islands that are a long ways off from the mainlands. The blue are the intermediate distance islands, and the green are the far islands. And in all cases, you can see that these more or less fit what theory would predict of island biogeography. I want to just end this discussion of theory of island biogeography with a classic experiment that was done by Dan Simberloff, who was one of Ed Wilson's students at Harvard way back. And they were looking for ways to experimentally test the theory of island biogeography. And the way that Simberloff and Wilson did this was they went into the Florida Keys and they found these little teeny cays, little teeny specks of mangrove that had nothing living on them but mostly spiders, arachnids, and crustaceans of one sort or another, insects. And they hired a fumigation company to come out and basically defauning these islands. They essentially just gassed them. Just like when you kill all the termites in your house, they killed all of the insects and spiders and all of these little teeny organisms on these islands, and they essentially created new uninhabited islands, and then they watched the rates at which these islands were recolonized by species. And here is a figure that shows the rate of colonization of the island that was closest. They had one that was near and one that was further away, and it more or less, and the dotted lines show the number of species that were on the island before the defaunation took place, and then these trajectories show the growth in species number. This experiment was done back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I don't remember exactly when it was, but right around that time. This is not something you'd probably ever be able to do again, but at the time, it was a very powerful and interesting experiment to ecologists and biogeographers that were interested in this sort of thing, species numbers and species diversity. Okay, so that's it for species, how many, and its species area relationships. Now I'm going to move on into actual species interactions, and I'm going to move to what I call, and what many other ecologists would call, bottom-up versus top-down forcing. What in the world does that mean? Well, let's go to the fundamentals of consumer-prey interactions. Nature is built, as I told you before, and as you all knew before you came into this class, all of nature is built around consumer-prey interactions. If we didn't have consumers eating prey, there would be nothing but plants. There would be nothing but autotrophs on the face of the earth. So really the whole fabric of nature, to a large degree, is dependent upon consumer-prey interactions. In a consumer-prey interaction, the prey has a positive effect on the consumer. The prey is fueling the consumer, increasing the consumer's fitness. The consumer, on the other hand, is having a negative effect on the prey. They eat the prey, and when they eat a prey, they kill it, all right? So this is the basic nature of a consumer-prey interaction. So let's go back to the notion of top-down versus bottom-up. What do we mean there? When we use the term bottom-up forcing, we are referring to a circumstance where the dynamics between the prey and the consumer is largely one in which the prey is fueling the abundance of the consumer. That is to say, the prey is not being affected much by the consumer, but the consumer is being very strongly affected by the nutritional impact of the prey. That's bottom-up forcing, and it's called bottom-up because the forcing starts at the bottom of the food web and moves upward. Top-down forcing is just the other side of that relationship, all right? That is the situation where the prey is having a very strong depleting effect. I'm sorry, the predator or the consumer is having a very strong depleting effect on the prey. And circumstances of that sort are referred to as top-down forcing. And they're called top-down forcing because they start higher in the food web toward the top and they proceed downward, all right? These links between prey and their consumers, which go from autotrophs, the plants, to herbivores, the things that eat the plants, to the carnivores that eat the herbivores, and so on and so forth, all the way to the apex predators, the top dogs in the system, so to speak, are all linked together in what ecologists call a food chain. This is a food chain. And there is a theory now that is developed around food chains that I want to tell you about because it's really important to the way we think about nature, all right? And that is here's the fundamentals of the theory. Let's imagine a system that is strongly under bottom-up control, all right? That simply means that every trophic level from the autotrophs, that is the plants, to the things that eat the plants, to the things that eat the plants, are going to become increasingly abundant as the production at the base of the food web increases. So as the production increases, let's say we add water and nutrients to the system, as the plants become more abundant, the things that eat the plants are going to become more abundant, and the things that eat those things are going to become more abundant. This is bottom-up forcing, and it's a unidirectional sort of monotonic function, and that it always goes upward. It's fundamentally different for top-down forcing. Imagine this situation where we just have three trophic levels: an autotroph, an herbivore, and a predator. If top-down forcing is important in this system and strong, then the predator from the top of the food web is going to have a strong depleting effect on the herbivores. That in turn is going to prevent the herbivores from depleting the plants. So under this circumstance, the predator is actually going to have a depleting effect on the herbivore and an enhancing effect on the plants. So in this particular case, all of the arrows, while they go in opposite directions, are not all of similar strength as they are during in this situation with top-down or bottom-up forcing. Okay. Bottom-up forcing. One of the most well-known names in this area of study of ecosystems was Ray Lindeman. Ray Lindeman unfortunately died quite young. He was a student, postdoc at Yale University back in the 50s and 60s. And he developed what is called the 10% rule. And the 10% rule, in very broad sense, is the foundation of what we call modern ecosystem ecology. The 10% rule simply says that because of the inefficiency of energy and material transport as you go from low in the food web to increasingly higher trophic levels, that the biomass, the amount of material that is maintained from, say, plants to herbivores, declines at each trophic level by about 90%. In other words, that's the inefficiency of the production that occurs because of respiration and because of all other sorts of things that go on within organisms. So that's the 10% rule. That means there are going to be about an order of magnitude more plants than there are of the herbivores that eat those plants, and there are going to be an order of magnitude more herbivores than there are of predators that eat those herbivores. That's based on the bottom-up theory. That's based on this 10% rule. There's a very different, oh, and here's an example of just some bottom-up forcing. This is an experiment that was done in a Midwestern lake where this lake was cordoned off and separated into two chunks, and nutrients were added to one side and not the other. And you can see that that indeed really increased the abundance of plants. And I haven't shown you what that did to the things that eat those plants, but they all went up in this particular case. Here's another example. This is an area where, from some of my work out in the Aleutian Islands, and this is simply a plot of maritime grassland where nutrients have been added, and you can see that bottom-up control, that the addition of nutrients has stimulated the growth of plants in this system. Here's another famous, very famous and cool experiment that is built around the notion of bottom-up forcing. And this is called the Iron X experiment. The Iron X experiment was really hatched by John Martin, who was a chemical oceanographer at Moss Landing Marine Labs. And what Martin did, he had this idea that iron was an important limiting nutrient in tropical oceans. So what he did was he took a barge full of iron, or a bunch of iron, he went out into the tropics and he dumped that iron in the ocean. All right. And then what he did was he measured the net primary production, the amount of carbon that was fixed per amount of water per time. All right. He measured that as a function of depth, starting from very deep water right up to the surface on day 1, day 2, and day 3, after he put the iron in, compared to a control, which is the red one here, that was outside this iron plume. And sure enough, you get a very strong and growing increase in production. This is bottom-up forcing. In this particular case, this limiting micronutrient, iron in the ocean, is really important to the abundance of plants and thus to the abundance of things that eat those plants. Top-down forcing and the theory of top-down forcing really links strongly to these three people who are famous ecologists, and they formulated, these were people from the University of Michigan, Nelson Harston Sr., Fred Smith, and Larry Slobodkin, and they formulated way back in the late 50s and early 60s an idea called the green world hypothesis, which was radically different than the Lindemann hypothesis, all right? The green world hypothesis was simply this. They looked around and said, in most places where there's enough rain and so on and so forth, the world is green. Why is it that? Why is that the case? Why is it that the herbivores don't eat all of this green? After all, they had known from looking at many places, including agricultural studies here and there, that herbivory, that the effect of herbivores can be devastating on plants. So what is it that keeps the world green if herbivores have the capacity to eat all of that green material? And their argument simply was predators keep them from doing that. In other words, the world is green because predators limit herbivores, thus allowing the world to be green. Okay. So these aren't mutually exclusive hypotheses. There have to be conditions in nature available for plants to exist, but these are two very important complementary ways of thinking about why the abundance of plants, herbivores, and predators are linked together in very different ways. So the Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin notion was embraced by this three trophic level system where we have predators, herbivores, and plants. And in this three trophic level system, the abundance of predators limits the abundance of herbivores and thus releases plants from being limited by herbivory. If you take the predators out of the system, this link between herbivores and plants shifts from being weak to strong. So in this two trophic level system, In a world that looked this way, the world would no longer be green. The herbivores would eat all of the plants. All right. Similarly, in a four trophic level system, you get exactly the same outcome. And that is the fourth trophic level predator removes the third trophic level predator, thus essentially allowing the system to behave as though there were no predators there at all. And so this is a theory that was put forth by Stephen Fretwell. And the theory simply says that the degree to which herbivores limit plants in nature is a function of the effective length of the food chain. If the effective length of the food chain is odd numbered, in other words, 1 or 3 or 5 or however many up you want to go, most food chains don't get that long, you're going to have you're essentially going to have plants becoming as abundant as they could possibly be based on the physical environment. Whereas in even numbered food chains, that is 2 or 4 or 6 links in the food chain, herbivores are going to be abundant and they are going to limit the plants. So you're going to have very strong plant herbivore plant interactions in even numbered food chains compared to odd numbered food chains. That was Fretwell's theory. And this idea that grew out of the notion of a predator influencing an herbivore and thus influencing a plant grew into the concept of what is now known as a trophic cascade. A trophic cascade is nothing more than the top-down effects from the apex predator downward through the food chain. That's what a trophic cascade is. One of the most important people in the development of this body of work historically was Robert Payne at the University of Washington. Cut off there a little bit, doesn't matter. It's a picture I took of Bob out at Tatoosh Island quite a number of years ago, where he worked and off the coast of Washington State. And what Payne essentially did was come up with this idea based on his own experiments of a relationship between predators and species diversity. And his idea was this, that in the absence of predators, prey compete strongly with one another, and the competitive dominance extinguish the competitive subordinates, so that in the absence, but in the presence of predators, predators limit these things. They prevent the competitors from excluding one another, and therefore predators in a system increase species diversity. This idea was based on Payne's work in the Rocky Intertidal, in which the dominant predator was the sea star, Pisasterocratius, and the dominant prey were shore mussels, sea mussels. And here is a picture that was taken by one of our former graduate students here at Santa Cruz, Don Hart, who repeated Payne's experiment right down below the marine lab here, in which she excluded the predators from some plots and allowed them free access to others. And you can see here what happened, that the mussels essentially completely took over. So I'm going to move now from there. Let me see what time it is. Let's see kind of how I'm doing for time. It's 11:40. I'm going to just, I think what I'll do is go through one more little section here, and then we'll take a brief break, and then we'll come back and finish up the class. So I want to go through some examples of trophic cascades from nature. And in these examples, what I would like you to pay attention to is the ecological processes. How are species interacting with one another, and what was done to see and understand these processes. Right? These are all going to be examples of trophic cascades. And I'll just give you the first one first, because this is an important example. Some of the early work, and this is from trophic cascades in lakes and rivers. And this work was done by two very well-known ecologists, Steve Carpenter and Jim Kitchell, the University of Wisconsin. And they worked right up in the northeastern part of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in lakes up in that area. And what they did was that they experimentally manipulated the presence of predatory fish in these lakes. So the food chain consists of 4 elements in this system. It consists of phytoplankton, the primary producers, zooplankton, these are Daphnia. We talked about Daphnia before. Daphnia feed on the phytoplankton. Planktivorous fish that feed on the Daphnia, and apex predatory fish that feed on the planktivorous fish. And the experiment, the perturbation that provided some insight into the dynamics of the system, was simply either the experimental removal or the experimental addition of these apex predatory fish. So here's one of the lakes that Carpenter and Kitchell worked on. It looks very similar to the one I showed you before. They simply found this lake that had a narrow connection, separated the 2 halves of the lake across that narrow connection, and removed the predatory fish from one side and moved them over into the other side. So on this side of the lake, the predatory fish have been removed. As a result, the planktivorous fish became more abundant. As a result, the zooplankton became less abundant. As a result, the phytoplankton became very abundant and the lake turned green. Over here, where we have a 4 trophic level system, where the predatory fishes were added back in, they limit the planktivorous fish. That in turn allows the zooplankton to become more abundant. That in turn limits the phytoplankton and the lake turns clear. Very cool stuff. You can actually see this effect from satellite images in the experiments that they've done. All right, I'm going to move now into the work that's been done in my lab over the years and talk about sea otters and kelp forests. But let's take a little break, run to the bathroom, get yourself a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is you want, and let's start right back in again. Let's see, it's 11:46, so let's start back in again at 11:55, okay? 9 minutes. And
Yellowstone, that the introduction of wolves in Yellowstone has actually tipped the scale so that the wolves are functioning as predators of herbivores, and that the whole ecology has improved over, let's say, the last 10 years because of the introduction of wolves. So that's one thing. Maybe you're going to use that example, I don't know. But the other thing is that I have been living on the East Cliff for the last 6 years. And when I came to Santa Cruz and looked at real estate, I took photographs of literally 20 or 30 or 40 sea stars when there was a minus tide in at least 3 different colors. And now at a minus tide, there might be 1.
okay,
And,
I can
and
answer
there's
both
so
those
many
questions.
anemone and so many mussels that you cannot possibly count them.
Yeah. Okay, so your first question, just hang on. We're going to talk about wolves in Yellowstone in just a moment.
Okay.
So I'm gonna go right into that system and tell you a little bit about it. So far as the sea stars are concerned, we have had over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years now a sea star wasting disease. And so the abundant sea stars that were in that system have become much less so because of this wasting disease. And so that's what's happened to them. This is not unprecedented. We've had wasting diseases before along this coast. They generally tend to be associated with warm water events. But this one that we're in now is very pronounced. And so it's caused a virtual extinction of all of the different species of sea stars. They're just much less abundant. They're starting to recover now in a few places, but that's probably the explanation for the the contrast that you saw looking down between earlier and now.
It's pretty big. I mean, I have some pictures of sun stars and little baby red, yellow, purple, brown stars. I mean, I've been photographing them all, and they're gone, completely gone.
It's a big deal. Yeah, they're gone. I mean, you're talking about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude decline.
Right.
That's what's happened because of this stuff. And it's happened all the way from the coast of Baja California all the way into Southeast Alaska.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, because I first learned about them actually in Sitka. I was there at a conference, and I have a photograph of a sea star, of a sun star, which is about 20 inches in diameter.
So if you go to Sitka Sound today, and I haven't been up there for a few years, but I have students that are working up there, you have a hard time finding a sunflower star there.
Wow.
They're gone. They'll be back. You know, they will probably be back. These disease things tend to be cyclic, and it's unlikely that this is an irreversible thing. But yeah, that's what's going on there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, what are we doing for time here? Give one more minute. Any other questions or clarifications?
Wow, those are good questions. My Susan going back to her. She's back to her.
Oh, her picture.
Ah. Now somebody's trying to talk.
No, they're
Oh,
chewing.
she's just eating. Oh.
She's eating.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, 11:55. Let's move forward and go through the rest of this, okay? So now I want to move to this next example. I told you about Steve Carpenter and Jim Kitchell's work in lakes, which is lovely because it's a large-scale whole ecosystem experiment. There have been very few of these done in ecology. And so this work has had a lot of impact on people because they were able to do these experimental studies, well-controlled, replicated studies at the scale of an entire lake. And what made that workable is that the boundary between the ecosystem, in this case, the forest on one side and the water on the other, is very, very distinct. And so you don't have to wonder about where it stops, all right? Now I'm going to move to the work I was mentioning earlier on sea otters and kelp forests that was largely done in my lab over the years. And in this case, the major players are the kelps, which are the autotrophs, photosynthesizers, the sea urchins, which are the herbivores, and sea otters, which are the predators, all right? System's a little more complicated than that, but these three groups of species are fundamentally important. The perturbation to this system that allowed an understanding of the dynamics was the Pacific maritime fur trade. So this is the species, the otter. And what happened was that otters were broadly distributed across the North Pacific from northern Japan all the way across Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, down into central to southern Baja California, up until about the mid-1700s. In the mid-1700s, they were discovered by the Bering expedition. That started the Pacific maritime fur trade, and that drove what previously had been an abundant sea otter population to the brink of extinction. The work we have done has been done in the Aleutian Islands because these are islands, and because they're islands, they form really useful large-scale natural experimental units. So the first part of this work was done simply by looking at a place called Amchitka Island, which is out in the western Aleutians, which was a site of the survival of a small colony of otters through the fur trade. So by the time I arrived on the scene, which was in 1970, they had recovered completely at Amchitka Island. There were probably somewhere in the range of 6,500 to 8,500 otters at Amchitka at that time. And over here, just a few hundred miles to the west in the near islands, they had been completely hunted to extinction. And in the early 1970s, there were no otters at all anywhere here. They had been here in large numbers. We knew that from a whole variety of sources of evidence, not the least of which were the midden sites, which indicated lots of otter bones were there way back when, but they were gone at this time. And it was really easy to just look at the system here, go over here to the near islands where otters had been taken out and look at the system and make an inference on what their effect was on the system. Here's some pictures just to give you a sense of what the Aleutians look like. A very wild, remote, maritime tundra on the rare clear day.
Mhm.
And the way that we over the years have done work on these islands is by ship. So it's the only way to get from island to island is to travel. And here, by the way, is a kelp bed. Doesn't look all that different from what you see off the coast here. This is what the seafloor at Mchitka Island looked like. Kelp everywhere. This is what the seafloor in the near islands look like. Urchins everywhere. Those green things are sea urchins, and there is not a kelp to be seen in this picture. And this is more or less an accurate characterization of what these systems look like over much larger scales of space and time. So that's the sea otter story. Otters, urchin, kelp, trophic cascade. Otters maintain the kelp forest by limiting sea urchins. And that was the initial evidence that led to that understanding. Now I'm going to move to the gray wolf story that came up a few moments ago, the question about wolves in Yellowstone. And this is a broader story about gray wolves in boreal forests in Western North America. The principal behind most of this work is Bill Ripple, who's at Oregon State University. The main ecological players are wolves, the predators, elk in the system, the herbivores, which are eaten by wolves, and trees, mostly aspen and willow, which are eaten by elk. The perturbation that allowed a look into the dynamics of this system was simply the extinction of wolves from North America. Wolves were hunted to extinction throughout Yellowstone National Park and all through the lower 48 up until about the 1940s. All right. There's a wolf. This is an interesting picture. A lot of the wolves in Yellowstone are white or black, and most of them are white. And this is one of the white color phase wolves. And here's a picture that was taken somewhere in Wyoming during the winter in an area where the wolves had not recovered. And these are elk, and these are aspen. This is wintertime. And what you see in this picture is a bunch of old senescent trees, just a few. Every tree that's in this system is probably 80 to 100 years old. Young trees absent. The reason the young trees are absent is because the elk have eaten them all. So here is an experiment, an exclosure that was done in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone, where a small patch of this grassland habitat was enclosed to keep the elk out. And you can see the effect is very, very obvious. Here is a picture. So wolves are then reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park about 30 years ago, something like that. And here's a picture of a place in the Lamar Valley prior to the introduction of wolves. And it's recognizable by this very distinctive, famous tree. And here is that same tree, that same landscape taken some years later after the wolves had been reintroduced. And so what has happened here? What's happened is that the wolves have caused the elk to change their behavior and decline in numbers, and that has released the intensity of herbivory in this system and allowed the willow population in this particular area to recover. So here's another example of a trophic cascade. The next one that I want to tell you about, I want to talk some about, is work done in Africa. Barry asked about Africa, and he mentioned that in many parts of Africa, you see these vast numbers of large, diverse mammals feeding in these savanna grassland systems. I want to tell you about the work that Tony Sinclair, who is at the University of British Columbia, he's retired now, he's about my age, Tony did over the course of his life in the Serengeti National Park. Serengeti National Park is in Tanzania, right at the border between Tanzania and Kenya. In fact, the Serengeti Park and the Masai Mara National Reserve Park are part of a larger functioning ecosystem. Tony's work was done mostly in Serengeti. These are tropical savanna systems, okay? The main ecological players are the large herbivorous mammals, the antelopes, the buffalo, the wildebeest, and a whole bunch of other species. A diversity of plants, mostly grasses and herbaceous plants in this system, and trees that are part of this system. And in this case, another important player is rinderpest. This is not a big predatory animal like in the wolf story or in the sea otter story. This is a disease. It is nonetheless a predator. Rinderpest is a very effective disease in limiting, in killing and limiting bovids, which are cattle-like animals in the family, the Bovidae that the cows are in, which includes most of the large African mammals. It includes buffalo, it includes wildebeest, which are the two really dominant mammals in the system that Tony worked in. The perturbation in this system was the spread of rinderpest from probably Ethiopia or the Middle East into Africa, into equatorial Africa, and then the subsequent control, the subsequent removal of rinderpest through wildlife veterinary techniques. Here's a picture of the area. Gorgeous place for any of you that have been there. With acacia and this kind of vast grassland landscapes covered with grasses and herbivores feeding in those grasses. And as I said, the Great Rinderpest is what provided a window into the understanding of the ecology of this system, and in particular, the trophic relationships that led to the grassland system. So as I said, rinderpest came from Ethiopia to tropical East Africa in somewhere in the late 1800s. It resulted in roughly a 95% reduction in large grazing animals. And not only was it these wildlife, the large grazing wildlife, but it was cattle. And so it became a big problem for people living in that part of the world, both because of the wildlife and because of their stock. And so there was an effort begun in the 1950s and early 60s to eradicate rinderpest. And it was an effort that involved inoculations. And I won't go into the details of how that was done. It seems like it would be very hard, but it wasn't all that difficult. And it was this expansion of rinderpest, killing the large animals, and then the removal of rinderpest and the recovery of the large animals that allowed Tony and his associates and many others that worked in this system to understand the dynamics of this food web, the trophic cascade. So here are some data just to show you how dramatic this effect is. So this just shows you the prevalence of rinderpest, through serosampling of both African buffalo in blue and wildebeest in red. And you can see that up until about the late 1950s, virtually every animal that was still living in that system was infected or had been exposed. They had all been exposed. The inoculation program started somewhere in the early 1960s, and by the late 1960s, it was gone, absolutely exterminated. It's not there anymore. They got rid of it. Amazing. And here's what happened to the wildebeest. So in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, because of the rinderpest, wildebeest were very rare. And after the removal in the early 1960s, they began to recover. There was no longer a limiting effect of rinderpest on these animals, and they started to increase. And they grew over the decades until you see just what we talked about last week, an equilibrium, a density dependence came into play where the wildebeest became as abundant in the system as they could be. And this is what it looks like today in places. Those are wildebeest, and they are abundant. And it's not hard to imagine that they have pretty strong impact on that system. So here's a picture that was taken in the Mara Triangle, a particular place in the Mara Triangle in northern Serengeti in 1944. It's an archive photo that Tony and others, somebody found. I think he found it someplace. And it's distinctive because of the geography. There are these two hills that are very clearly identifiable based on their shape and relationship to one another. So he was actually able to go back out, knowing the history of the photographer and where this person took pictures and so on, and to find this site again decades later, after the rinderpest was removed. And here it is today. Amazing. All that brush is gone. Those herbivores have basically, they have not denuded this system, but they have removed the plant biomass. They have reduced it to such a dramatic level that it's had this huge impact on the system. So there are 3 examples that I've given you, and there are many others, but this should be sufficient for you to both to sort of emblazon in your minds how important trophic cascades can be in 3 fundamentally different systems. The boreal forest systems in North America with wolves and elk and plants, the kelp forest systems of the North Pacific with sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp, and the savanna grassland savanna systems of eastern equatorial Africa, which involve rinderpest as the control agent, wildebeest and buffalo and other large mammals as the main grazers, and the plants in the system. So there are others. I told you about the lake work. There are any number or dozens of other examples of trophic cascades that I could recount here, but this, as I said, should be sufficient to make the point about not only how these things work and how they were discovered, but how dramatic their effects are on the distribution and abundance of species. So now I'm going to move to the last part of today's class. And I'm going to take some time to talk about this. This is going to be a discussion of ecological network, what I call linkage and connectivity. And I could build this discussion of ecological networks around a lot of different processes, but I'm going to build it around, in this particular case, trophic cascades and what we call the knock-on effects of trophic cascades, and how nature is put together through the linkage of species beyond just these simple predator, herbivore, plant interactions. And I'm going to go back to 2 examples, the gray wolf example and the sea otter example. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain these things. I'm going to revisit the dynamics of the trophic cascades, and I'm going to tell you about what those of us that have worked in these systems have learned about the complexity of the linkage and connectivity of these systems, the way species and ecological processes are put together in nature. So this is the wolf story, and I'm going to tell the wolf story with just one figure, and I'm going to walk you through some of the dynamics. So the story I told you has to do with wolves, elk, and plants, woody plants. Wolves have a strong effect, a limiting effect on elk. There are other predators that are part of this story. It's not just a wolf story, but wolves are one of the more important of those players for sure. Elk are probably the only really, well, elk and maybe bison in this system, but at the time this work was done, elk were the major herbivores in the system. So there are 2 pathways in this particular system, the one I told you about that leads from wolves to elk, and another one that goes from wolves to coyotes. So let's go down those pathways and let me tell you about what folks have learned about these systems and how they are linked over larger scales. Wolves affect elk, elk affect woody plants, and those woody plants have all kinds of impacts on nature. They have an effect on stream morphology. So when you take the plants out of nature, it allows the streams to essentially cut down. They no longer meander, so the water table declines. When the water table declines and the streams straighten out and the plants are gone, beaver are affected. beaver are lost from the system because they need these plants to build beaver dens. And when the beavers are lost from the system, beaver dams are no longer produced, and the water table declines even further as a result of that. The plants provide habitat for birds, and so the diversity of neotropical migrant birds is very strongly impacted by this situation. Bird species diversity goes down. Plants reproduce in many cases. Many of these plants are fruit-producing plants. They produce berries, and those berries are fruit that are consumed by other species, and in particular, they are consumed by grizzly bears. So this interaction from wolves to elk to plants to the fruits of the plants feeds back and has a very strong impact on the bears and their diet. And so what people have seen as the wolves have recovered is that the importance of berries in the diet of the bears has increased as well. These elk, when they are killed by a wolf, provide carrion. And this has a big effect on scavengers in the system. So scavengers are linked into all of this. So that's one pathway. That's the pathway we've discussed, from wolves to elk to woody plants and back on into the ecosystem to influence berry production and birds and water table and all the rest of the stuff that's so important to the basic configuration of the ecosystem, to other very charismatic and species of considerable interest to people like bears. The other pathway that is becoming now well known goes from wolves to coyotes. So when wolves were lost from North America, coyotes became much more abundant. And that's simply because wolves don't tolerate coyotes very well. And so when wolves were common in the system, they either ate the coyotes or chased them off. All right. The coyotes are predators on pronghorn antelope, pronghorn calves. All right. The fawns actually have pronghorn. Wolves don't eat the fawns because they're too small. Coyotes do. And so with the reintroduction of wolves into parts of the greater Yellowstone system, coyote numbers went down, reproductive success of pronghorns went up because the fawn survival went way up. Here's another one that's very cool that is just now coming to light that I think you can all relate to in some ways because you're all familiar with Lyme disease. How in the world could wolves be linked to Lyme disease? Well, they probably are. And here is the pathway by which they are. Wolves have an influence on coyotes. Coyotes, in turn, have an impact on foxes because just as wolves limit coyotes, coyotes limit small carnivores like foxes. Foxes, it turns out, are very important predators of small mammals. Small mammals are an important intermediate species in the life history of deer ticks. Deer ticks are the carrier of Borrelia. Borrelia is the agent, it's a bacterium. Borrelia is the agent of Lyme disease. This is work that was done by Chris Wilmers in environmental studies and his student, Tal Levy, who was here back in the early, 6-8 years ago now. So Tal and Chris and Marm Kilpatrick, who Barry had mentioned was involved with some of this work as a disease ecologist, and Mark Mangle, who is retired from UC Santa Cruz, who's a modeler, a mathematician. The four of them got together and they put together a lot of information, models and empirical information to essentially show that as coyotes changed in numbers, so did the incidence of Lyme disease in the Midwestern up through the Northeastern United States. And this is probably all an epiphenomenon of the loss of wolves from that system. So here is a case of a potential linkage from a predator by way of a trophic cascade of sorts that actually links back to things that influence people, human health, human disease in ways that no one had any concept of until a decade or less ago. I'm going to end the class with a little bit more detailed explanation of some of the same kinds of things that my colleagues and I have looked at and studied and have come to understand about the sea otter system. Again, just to remind you, sea otters are involved in a trophic cascade. When otters are abundant, they limit urchins. That allows kelp to become abundant. When otters are lost from the system, urchins become abundant, kelp disappears. In this case, the knock-on effects, most of the ones that we know about, link to the importance of kelp in the system. Kelp is the foundation of these coastal ecosystems. It provides habitat. It is a primary producer. It produces organic material by photosynthesis. And this in turn influences other species and ecological processes. So here's just some examples. This is from a review paper that we had in Science back in 2011. And this just shows, again, using the same basic approach of studying areas with and without otters, either spatial contrast between places where otters are present or absent, or watching systems through time as the sea otters had either recovered or become lost. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Using those, been able to look at what the effects of this kelp have been on other species in the system. So one of the things, and so in all of these figures, the blue bars represent data from systems where otters are abundant, and the brown bars represent data from systems where otters are absent or reduced. So fish abundance. If you look at the abundance of fish in coastal systems, you can see that they're about 8 times greater when otters are abundant. Huge effect on coastal fish. Why is that? Simple, because they live in the kelp. And when the kelp's gone, the fish disappear or become very much less abundant. The diet of seagulls, something you would perhaps never really think might be linked to the otters, but it is. And that's because the otters have a really strong impact on both the abundance of fish and the abundance of invertebrates in the system. And so if you look at the diet of gulls in places where otters are abundant, what you find is that they are what we call piscivores. They eat fish. That's what the F is here, okay? So the proportion of the diet of gulls in these places where otters are abundant is about 90% fish, 10% invertebrates. When the otters are lost, it flip-flops, about 10% fish or even less to almost entirely invertebrates. So the effect of otters on the gulls is through their diet, and it essentially changes these gulls to behaving like effectively different species. The growth rate of mussels. So mussels are what we call filter feeders. They essentially filter organic particles from the water column, and those organic particles are produced by kelp as it breaks down and forms what we call detritus. So in the water where there is a lot of kelp, there's also a lot of these small organic particles of kelp and bacteria and other things that are all related to the production of kelp, and that fuels the growth of mussels. And if you look at the growth rates of any filter feeder in this system, these are just some data from the mussels, they are twice as high in places where otters are abundant compared with where otters are absent. And that's simply because the production is less, the amount of detritus in the water column is less, and thus the growth rate of these filter feeders, which is a very important mode of foraging in a lot of species of things like mussels and barnacles and such in coastal ecosystems, are impacted. And the last little example I want to give you is fairly similar to the gull example, but it involves another species, and that is bald eagles, which are also quite abundant in the Aleutian Islands. And essentially what you see in the diets of eagles is that when otters are abundant, they feed not equally in equal amounts, but in all 3 cases, both birds, which are B, fish, which are F, and other mammals, which are M, form important parts of the bald eagle's diet. When the otters are lost from the system, fish become much less common in their diets, mammals become much less common in their diet, and they become largely seabird predators. When they become seabird predators, they also start to accumulate more in the way of organic pollutants. And the reason for this is that seabirds move around a lot, and they fly from the Aleutian Islands over the coast of China and Japan and all over the place, and they pick up DDT and PCBs and all that sort of stuff. And so what we have seen in looking at the Aleutians is that when otters are lost, the contaminant levels in bald eagles goes up, and that's because they become more focused on feeding on seabirds, which are much more mobile and dispersive feeders across the oceans than are either the coastal fishes or the coastal marine mammals that are in that system. I'm going to move now to another dimension to the linkage of this system, and that linkage in this system, and that involves killer whales. So here's a picture from the Aleutian Islands of a killer whale in a kelp forest hunting sea otters. And what this illustration shows, which is from a paper we published in Science back in 1998, is it shows what happened to the coastal ecosystem in the early to mid 1990s up to the turn of the century and right up to the present, when this system was invaded by otter foraging killer whales. And I'll explain to you what we think that happened later. But what we saw is exactly predictable from Fretwell's theory. That is, when the system started out back in the 70s and 80s and up until the early 90s, otters were abundant, urchins were rare, kelp were abundant. And you can see that in these plots. The abundance of otters was high to start with. The abundance of urchins was low to begin with, and the abundance of kelps were high to begin with. And as the system was invaded by the killer whales and the otters were driven downward, and you can see those declines in these data, you can actually see the numbers of individuals going down abruptly by the late 1990s and the turn of the century. By the turn of the century, they had declined, the otter populations had declined by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So for example, the population at Adak Island, where I had been working at the time that we were studying this, declined from probably somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 animals to about 150. That's how much this population declined as a result of the killer whales eating them. The consequences were predictable. Otters gone, urchins become abundant. You can see that here. Kelps become rare. You can see that here. This system switched from being a 3 trophic level system to a 4 trophic level system. This is probably one of the better examples from nature of this food chain theory that I talked about earlier. Why did that happen? What in the world would cause killer whales, which have been around for a long time and were around offshore in that system, what would cause them to come in and start eating the otters in such large numbers when they did? We think it had to do, the most parsimonious hypothesis at this point, which is admittedly somewhat uncertain just due to the nature of the data, but in my opinion is the most compelling and consistent explanation, given the data that we have and all the evidence that we have, is that this was actually linked to post-World War II industrial whaling. So this upper panel, which is from a paper we published back in the early 2000s in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, shows the locations of the kills post-World War II of whales in the North Pacific. And right after the war, starting in 1946 on up through the early 1950s, most of those kills occurred off the coast of Japan, off Russia, and a few off the coast of British Columbia. As time progressed, whaling expanded. Post-World War II whaling expanded to spread across the Aleutian Islands. By the early 60s to late 70s, it was massive. There were huge numbers of animals taken. That resulted in a collapse of the great whales. The collapse of the great whales then resulted in a spreading southward away from the North Pacific of the remaining whaling. And so this illustration down to your lower right just shows the number of whales that were killed, all right? The proportion of the total number killed within 200 nautical miles. I think it's nautical miles or kilometers, I've forgotten which now, but anyway, it's in a relatively small distance from the Aleutian Islands, fairly large distance actually. And you can see that in 1950, there were virtually none. It rose to a maximum in about 1960, just like you see here, and then it collapsed to zero with the end of industrial whaling in the North Pacific and the institution of the International Whaling Moratorium that occurred at that time. That's the history of whaling in the North Pacific. That's what happened in these areas around the Aleutians where I worked. And what we saw was this. We saw the sea otter numbers go down. But what we also recognized happened in looking back from the work that other people had done and some of the data was that this wasn't the only thing to go down. That 10 years earlier, the stellar sea lion populations collapsed. And 10 years before that, the harbor seal population collapsed. And so the idea is that what happened here is that these whales were essentially a key food resource for these mammal-eating killer whales. And that either the calves of these whales or the dead carcasses of these large populations were nourishing these mammal-eating killer whales. And when they were stripped out of the system, that pressed the killer whales to expand their diet to feeding on other coastal species of marine mammals that were less abundant than the big whales, that were less capable of defending themselves than the big whales, and were thus driven downward very abruptly in abundance as a result of that. So this system is a really great example of what Darwin called a tangled bank. As I mentioned in the beginning of the class, Darwin was one of the great naturalists. Not only was he instrumental in the theory of evolution by natural selection, but he understood the dynamics of nature. He was a great naturalist, and he coined this term, nature as a tangled bank, to reflect what he recognized as the importance of interactions among species. And so this illustration, which is just from a review that several of us published a few years ago on the effects of megafauna in ocean systems, shows the sea otter, urchin, kelp, trophic cascade, how that is linked to other species like gulls and fish and filter feeders and sea stars. I didn't talk about that, but it does affect the sea stars and eagles, and how that on the other side of it is influenced out in the pelagic zone of the North Pacific by things like industrial whaling, the effect that that had on another big predator in the system, and the influences that that has had on various other species, including the depleting effect of otters and the whole shift of the coastal ecosystem. Here's an event that occurred hundreds of miles away from the sites in which these events have occurred a half a century earlier that led to this chain reaction of interactions that caused the coastal ecosystem to collapse. So here is an example, again, of a system that is deeply linked, that is deeply interconnected in space and in time. It gives you an example of how important species interactions can be in influencing the distribution of species that you may see in today's world at any particular place that you might look. So that's pretty much it. Where am I here? I am at 12:30. I'll have a little time for some additional discussion if you care for it. But I would just like to draw your attention to this book for those of you that are interested. This is a book that was published, co-edited by John Terborg and myself, entitled Trophic Cascades, and it is a somewhat technical book, but I think fairly readable, of overview of trophic cascades across global ecosystems. This was published by Island Press back in 2010 or 9, I've forgotten which now. And then the last little bit that I want to share with you is my own book, my own memoir, which is called Serendipity. It was published by the University of California Press in 2016. And this is essentially a fairly personal accounting of my own story of work in science and a lot of the things that I've talked about in substantially more detail than I've had time to talk about them here, but nonetheless written in a way that was intended for people like all of you who are just reasonably well educated, interested, general public. It's not technical. Most of it is not a technical book. So let's just end it all by going to, again, a recap of the high points of what we talked about today. So I began by talking about the concept of an interaction web, the way species and the physical environment are all put together in this thing we call an interaction web. And we talked about species diversity, talked about how many species there are in the world and how many species there have been over the course of life on Earth, just the kind of crude estimates and accounts that we have now. Then we moved from species diversity to species area, talking about the relationship between the number of species and the amount of habitat that there might be. And that discussion of species area led to a discussion of MacArthur and Wilson's theory of island biogeography and the way that they envisioned and measured and sort of began thinking about the diversity of species on islands. We moved from there to a particular type of species interaction, that is consumer-prey interactions, and from consumer-prey interactions to a discussion of food chains and food webs, food chains simply being linked consumer-prey interactions and food webs being even more complex assemblages of food chains that are all connected together. We moved from there to the dynamics of these systems of food chains and food webs, to a discussion of the directionality of forcing, bottom-up forcing, when the food is what limits the consumer, top-down forcing, when the consumer limits the food. From there to food chain theory. I told you a little bit about Ray Lindemann's ideas and work, the 10% rule, which has come to be the foundation of what we call ecosystem ecology, and top-down forcing, the ideas of Harrison Smith and Slobodkin, the green world hypothesis, Bob Payne, Steve Fretwell, the ideas that have come to be part of what we call food web ecology or species ecology. We talked about Fretwell's food chain link theory, odd even link food chains, and the predictions of that theory on how plants are influenced by herbivores in nature. Talked about trophic cascades, what they are. We went through some examples from nature of trophic cascades. We talked in a couple of cases, that is the case of the wolf and the case of the sea otter, on some of the what we call the knock-on effects of trophic cascades, how the influence of a predator on plants can resonate through the system and influence all kinds of other things. And we ended with a really big, large-scale discussion of linkages between ecosystems, of how systems can actually be connected together, so that something that's happening in your own backyard very well may have started from something way off, connected in ways that you might not have ever even imagined. So there you have it. That's our 4-class introduction to ecology. I've had a great time doing this. I hope you've learned something. Let's take the last few minutes and have whatever discussion we want. And oh, thank you for joining. I'm going to miss it. Okay. Anyone and all can unmute and we can kind of go from there.
Cindy, you have a question, but unmute yourself.
There. I was wondering, close to home here, about the relation of mountain lions and the predators and the rise in Lyme disease that we're seeing. We don't get them directly from deer. Do they go someplace else before they come to us, like me all the time?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work done on Lyme disease and deer. Some of it's been done locally. So Chris Wilmer's lab has had most of the lead on this in environmental studies. They've done some very elegant work showing relationships. The connection to disease has not been established or is not well known. Sorry, let me move my head here. Has not really been studied in the Western US. Lyme disease is not as prevalent in California as it is in the Midwest or the Northeast. In the Northeast, it's terrible. In parts of the Midwest, it's terrible. It's so bad that people are terrified to even go out in nature, for getting that stuff. Whether there's a link here with Lyme disease, I cannot say. I don't know. I'm convinced that there is an important link with Lyme disease in the Midwest and the Northeast. The deer, so the tick that carries the Lyme disease, the deer tick, actually is a complicated animal. It has various life stages from these larvae that grow out of the eggs to instars to adult ticks. And the instars, the small intermediate life stages, feed on small mammals, and the adults feed on large mammals like deer. And it was thought for some time that it was the deer abundance that was driving the abundance of ticks and thus Lyme disease. In the Northeast, it's been shown that that's not the case. Deer are so abundant in that system that the waxing and waning of deer over the decades has not really had any impact on ticks. The small mammals, which are a critical host to the instars of the ticks, do drive the abundance of ticks and thus the abundance of Lyme disease. So that seems to be what's going on there. What's going on here, what regulates tick populations, as far as I know, there's nobody working on ticks here. There's been a lot of fabulous work done on ticks and disease ecology in the Northeast, much of which has been led by one of our former undergraduates, Richard Osfeldt, who's a senior ecologist now at the Institute of Ecosystem Studies up in New York. And he and his group have done most of that work. That's sort of a long way around my answer to your question, which is I don't know. I don't know.
Do mountain lions have an important role in our local ecosystem?
Almost for sure. It's been shown, this is Chris, I'm telling you, the people that were involved with this work, Chris Wilmers, several of his former students, Justine Smith, who's now a professor at Davis, Justin Sirachi, who is a postdoc and just leaving Chris's lab, and Terry Williams, who's been involved with doing a lot of the energetics work. They have shown that the deer and other animals in the system and the cougars and the mountain lions are behaviorally linked together in pretty strong ways. And the abundance of deer in our system on the campus of UCSC and around this part of the world is probably to some degree been enabled by the general lack of big predators in the system. Mountain lions are becoming more abundant in California. They are protected now. I think their abundance on our campus and around is somewhat increasing, but they're also a very, very wary wild animal. And so it's hard to know exactly what's going on. But the evidence from their work is that the deer are very much influenced by mountain lions, and mountain lions are the only large native predator in this system that exists at this time. There may have been others, but wolves were not part of this system. So gray wolves never occurred in these coastal ecosystems. Coyotes probably are not sufficiently effective predators to limit deer populations, but cougars are effective killers, and they are very efficient at killing deer and probably have a big effect both on the abundance of deer and where deer occur in nature. And that's been shown elsewhere, I should say. And other people have worked on this same question. So Barry, you asked, do cougars affect deer? Bill Ripple and his people have worked on this same question in Utah, and they've essentially compared river drainages in Utah, which are in park systems that are commonly visited by people with more remote drainages, which are rarely visited by people. And they have documented the relative abundance of deer and cougars and all kinds of other stuff in those systems that pretty much tells the same trophic cascade story.
Okay. Leslie, unmute yourself.
Jim, are you familiar with the organization that I think has its roots locally called Island Conservation?
I am.
Because, I mean, to me, that's just a huge example of how humans manipulating in particular, getting rid of, I guess, invasive species
Yeah,
on islands completely gets the islands back to how they were before human intervention occurred.
So island conservation has focused primarily on island birds. That's what they're mostly interested in the conservation of island birds. And the main process that island conservation has been involved with has been the effect of exotic species, both predators, things like cats, feral cats, introduced rats, snakes, things of this sort that are not supposed to be on these systems that have devastated bird populations. So yeah, island conservation is really mostly all about getting rid of predators that aren't supposed to be there. That figure that I showed, the illustration, some of you, if you know island conservation, you probably know Don Kroll, who's one of our faculty here in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and Don was one of the founders of island conservation. And we worked together on a study in the Aleutians where we were looking at introduced foxes. Foxes were exotic species that were introduced onto all of those islands after the removal of sea otters. And the foxes trashed the island bird populations, and the loss of the island bird populations broke the linkage of nutrient delivery by these birds that roosted on land that fed at sea. And so that experiment that I showed you was an attempt to look at the degree to which nutrients were limiting those grassland systems that had been invaded by foxes. And it was very strong. So, yep, these things happen everywhere. They happen a lot in different places. And those are some, I could go on and on and on and teach a class that is built entirely around that one dynamic.
Susan.
The great white sharks, which seem to be abundant this year in Monterey Bay, but seems to have been growing also over the last couple of years. Is there any explanation for that?
Well, there are lots of explanations, or at least ideas, and some of them are pretty good ideas, I think, and there's some substance to them. Sharks are difficult animals to understand, their population biology. I mean, they're remote, they're big animals that, so we don't know as much about them as we do about other species. But a couple of things have happened that have probably impacted the shark population growth. And the evidence indicates that they are indeed increasing in this area and along this coast. One of the things that has happened is that they are being protected from exploitation. So there aren't as many of them killed in net operations and things of that sort that as were killed in the past. The other important likely influence on the shark populations is the recovery of elephant seals and harbor seals. And so what's happened is that these seal populations at places like Año Nuevo and then down at in Cambria and places where large local populations of seals have become reestablished, produce a lot of pups, and those pups are amongst the primary preferred prey of the sharks, and so the shark numbers are going up as a result of that, or at least are becoming more prevalent in these areas as a result of that. There's been some controversy, there's uncertainty, I should use that word, it's a better term. There's uncertainty about how much the overall population has really changed, but I can just tell you that from my own experience, I spend a fair amount of time on the bay because I'm a fisherman and I see sharks. Last few years, I've seen a lot of white sharks out there, and I hadn't seen many at all up until then. The white shark increase, you ask a question, you're going to get some other answers that you hadn't anticipated. And so one of the things that's happened as clearly as a result of this resurgence of white sharks is that the attack rate on sea otters has gone way up. And so when I first came to California in the 1970s, we might find 1 or 2 carcasses a year that have been shark bit. And what's interesting about otters and sharks is that when a shark grabs a sea otter, they don't eat them. They grab them just like they grab a surfer and they spit them out. They appear to have mistaken the identity of these animals for maybe a young seal pup or something of that sort. But immediately when they sense the sea otter, they open their jaws and the otter swims off and then usually dies because they've already been bitten by the teeth of a great white shark. So those animals typically wash ashore and we find them. And what we've seen is that those numbers have gone from 1 or 2 a year now to over 150 a year. And there are so many otters now that are being killed that seems to be one of the major drivers of the abundance of sea otters in Central California. So here again, you have this interesting connection between the recovery of elephant seals and the sharks and sea otters and what sea otters are doing in the system and so on and so forth.
Okay. Other questions? Well, I think maybe we've come to the end of a great course, Jim. This was really thorough, and I think you see everybody applauding there. All right.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. I love doing this. It was something that gave me some purpose in the last month to kind of sit down and get this stuff together and have to do it every week. And I enjoyed it. I hope you all have learned something, and maybe down the line, I'll do another class of some kind if there's interest in more environmental types of things and ecological things. But I had a great time doing it, and very happy that you all were able to participate. So thanks so much for that.
All right. So thanks to everybody. All right. We will see you in future OLLI courses.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Jim.
You're very welcome. Bye all.